Ava Wallace believed she ruled the cabin, her crisp uniform and strict demeanor demanding total obedience from every passenger who dared step on board. But when a gentle, elderly traveler tried to claim a seat in first class, Ava's unyielding sense of authority set off a chain of events she never could have anticipated. Accusations flew, tension soared, and the entire flight found itself on edge. Would Ava realize her grave mistake before it was too late? Where are people watching from? Leave a comment, like, share, and subscribe. Ava Wallace stepped onto the airplane with practiced confidence, the crisp navy blue uniform hugging her frame as she walked down the aisle. She held her head high, believing wholeheartedly that the cabin was her domain. A brand new day of service lay ahead, and Ava was certain she had full command of every detail, from the overhead baggage compartments to the seatbelt signs overhead. From the moment she greeted the first few passengers, Ava's tone was clipped yet polite. She prided herself on efficiency, convinced that her swiftness and no-nonsense attitude set the standard for a professional flight attendant. Any sign of uncertainty or confusion among travelers sparked in her an almost immediate response, to correct, instruct, and, if necessary, admonish them. While her colleagues occasionally teased her about being a little too strict, Ava brushed off their comments, telling herself that travelers appreciated precision and order. Moments before the doors closed, an elderly woman named Claire Watson stepped aboard. She clutched a paper ticket in one trembling hand and a handbag in the other. Carefully adjusting her cardigan, Claire paused at the entrance to the first-class cabin, then looked for her assigned seat. Ava spotted her immediately. Something about the woman's demeanor made Ava assume there had been a mistake. It was not unheard of for confused passengers to wander into a section where they did not belong, and Ava felt certain this was another such case. Clearing her throat, Ava approached. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but you may have the wrong seat," she stated, her professional smile intact but her voice firm. Claire blinked, then quietly offered her ticket for inspection. Ava barely glanced at it. From her stance it was inconceivable that this gentle, soft-spoken woman had legitimately purchased a spot in first class. Instead of double-checking the passenger manifest, Ava simply returned the ticket and pointed toward the main cabin. "I need you to move back there, please," she said, gesturing for Claire to exit the premium area. Claire's wrinkled hands gripped the ticket a little tighter. In a hesitant but steady tone, she insisted that the seat number on her ticket matched the row and seat displayed above. A murmur rose among a handful of onlookers. Some were curious, others displayed visible discomfort. One or two opened their mouths to speak up for Claire, but Ava's posture discouraged interruption. She was, in her mind, upholding the rules of the airline, ensuring that each passenger was in the correct seat. Yet in her rush to maintain order, she overlooked the possibility that her assumption might be wrong. Growing impatient, Ava raised her voice a notch, demanding that Claire leave the plane to sort out the ticket issue with the gate agent. Confusion flashed across Claire's eyes, but she began to step back, realizing she had little choice. In that charged moment, Ava felt an unmistakable twinge of power. She believed she was fulfilling her duty by removing a disruptive presence, never stopping to consider the consequences of casting out a frail and frightened passenger in such a manner. The tension in the cabin did not fade with Claire Watson's forced departure. If anything, it grew more intense as soon as she stepped into the jet bridge, escorted by an apologetic but powerless gate agent. Passengers who had witnessed the exchange whispered to one another, some shaking their heads in disbelief at Ava Wallace's iron-fisted approach. Others cast suspicious glances at the empty first-class seat, wondering whether the elderly traveler had truly been in the wrong. Ava, for her part, stood near the front galley, her arms tightly folded. She felt a mixture of lingering self-satisfaction and a faint prickle of uncertainty. Were it not for her strict personal rule never to doubt herself in public, she might have grabbed the flight manifest and double-checked the seat assignment. Instead, she remained steadfast, convinced she had done the airline a favor by removing an unfit passenger. As the final boarding call rang out, the pilot's voice came through the intercom, announcing that the doors would soon close. Just then, a tall man rushed down the aisle, frowning deeply. His expression carried an intensity that demanded attention. This was Charles Watson, Claire's son, who had rushed onto the plane the moment he learned his mother had been barred from taking her rightful seat. Charles wasted no time seeking out Ava. "I need an explanation," he said, voice trembling with controlled anger. "My mother just called me in tears. She has a first-class ticket, but someone ordered her off the plane." Standing at the threshold of the cockpit, he addressed one of the pilots, who seemed only partially aware of the drama unfolding behind him. When the pilot deferred the question back to Ava, Charles turned to face her directly. Ava's spine went rigid, her defensive instincts flaring. She repeated her assumption that Claire must have been mistaken about her seating, then added that she had no choice but to remove a passenger causing a disturbance. Charles bristled at the implication that his mother was some sort of troublemaker. "She's traveled enough to know her seat number," he said with an edge to his voice. "I have the seat confirmation right here on my phone." Holding up his phone, Charles showed a digital boarding pass that matched the exact first-class seat Ava had claimed belonged to someone else. A hush fell over the nearby rows. Some of the other travelers craned their necks to see. Realizing there was a discrepancy, Ava felt the first pang of doubt. She glanced around, suddenly hyper-aware of all the curious eyes upon her. Before Ava could muster a coherent reply, a senior crew member arrived, alerted to the commotion by the flight deck. The older attendant examined Charles's digital boarding pass, cross-referenced it with the official manifest, and found that, indeed, Claire Watson was entitled to the seat. A flicker of shock crossed Ava's face. She had never once considered that she might be in the wrong. An uncomfortable warmth crept over her cheeks as she gripped the edge of a seat for support. Charles, the senior attendant, and several onlookers waited for Ava's reaction. Instead of owning her mistake, she stood in defensive silence. Perhaps she hoped the moment would somehow pass without formal consequences. But Charles, determined to protect his mother's dignity, pressed further. "I want to speak to whoever's in charge," he demanded. "My mother deserves an apology, and someone needs to be held accountable for this." The pilot, now fully aware of the escalating situation, took in a deep breath and conferred with the senior attendant. Together, they decided that Ava's behavior warranted immediate disciplinary action. Word spread quickly among the crew that Ava had acted far beyond her authority in forcing an innocent passenger to leave the aircraft. Meanwhile, Claire was still waiting at the gate, visibly distraught, unsure whether she could board at all. When the flight manager, who was operating out of the airline's central hub, learned of the unfolding drama, she gave the directive to terminate Ava on the spot. A wave of disbelief rolled through the cabin as the verdict was communicated. Charles, who had been bracing himself for a cursory apology, was stunned by the swift repercussions. While he believed Ava's behavior was unacceptable, he also recognized the severity of losing a job in such a manner. Shaken, Ava followed the senior attendant's instruction to gather her belongings. The pilot made an announcement that there would be a short delay before takeoff, and many passengers began recording on their phones. Some documented Ava's shocked expression, her unsteady gait as she moved down the aisle in her pressed uniform for what would be the last time. The dull roar of conversation blended with the hum of the plane's air conditioning, creating a tense soundtrack to Ava's final walk as an employee of the airline. Once off the aircraft, Ava found herself in the stark brightness of the jet bridge. Security personnel and the human resources representative awaited her. They confiscated her badge and requested that she remove any airline-issued items, including her blazer with the company's insignia. Stripped of her professional identity, Ava felt small and exposed. It was as though the job she had once worn like a shield was now dissolving before her eyes. Back inside the airport terminal, Claire, with Charles by her side, finally reboarded. Relief mixed with lingering fear for both mother and son, but they took their seats in first class. Passengers whispered words of comfort to Claire, and several apologized on behalf of the airline. The overhead bins clicked shut, and at last the doors sealed for a delayed departure. Though Claire's flight would proceed, the incident had left a bitter aftertaste that no complimentary meal or beverage could fully wash away. In the following days, Ava found herself in a haze of disbelief and regret. The airline had been her life, she had trained rigorously, taken pride in her polished appearance, and identified strongly with her position's authority. Now, that authority was gone, along with her paycheck, her prestige, and her sense of self. She wandered through the airport's public areas, unable to enter the crew lounges or secure corridors that had once felt like home. Each time she passed an active flight attendant, she felt a surge of envy and a stab of shame. Word spread quickly among her former colleagues. Some pitied Ava, others shook their heads, remarking that she should have known better. A handful of individuals who had once admired her decisiveness now labeled it as arrogance. In the midst of these judgmental whispers, Ava realized she had painted herself into a corner by refusing to admit even the possibility of an error. Late one evening, desperate for a lifeline, Ava picked up her phone and dialed the number of a friend from training school. Though they had not spoken in months, she clung to the hope that he might empathize or at least offer practical advice on what to do next. The friend listened patiently as Ava recounted the events, her voice trembling with sorrow and lingering anger. Through the line, she heard his gentle but firm words, "You have to accept responsibility for what happened. No one's going to believe in your growth if you don't recognize where you went wrong." His statement hung in the air like an undeniable truth. Ava felt tears slip down her cheeks as she finally admitted, out loud, that she had acted out of control. In her quest to maintain authority, she had neglected the basic principle of customer service, treating people with empathy. In the weeks that followed, Ava confronted the aftermath head-on. She drafted an apology letter to Claire Watson and Charles. Although she did not have a direct way to contact them, she forwarded her heartfelt words to the airline, hoping they would pass the message along. She started attending workshops on emotional intelligence and conflict resolution, determined to learn the skills she had once dismissed as irrelevant. Gradually, Ava came to realize that her uniform and badge had not bestowed power on her. Instead, her real power had always come from the capacity to help others, to guide them through a safe and pleasant journey. By clinging to authority for its own sake, she had forgotten the very reason she had become a flight attendant in the first place. One morning, after weeks of soul-searching, Ava awoke with a renewed determination. She resolved to find a new path, whether it involved returning to the airline industry or branching into another customer-facing role. Wherever she went, she would carry with her the lesson she had learned: respect and compassion are far more vital than any illusion of control. Though her future remained uncertain, Ava found a sense of peace in the knowledge that she was finally taking responsibility. For the first time in her adult life, she felt free to create a new story for herself, one grounded in humility, empathy, and genuine service to others. By accepting the consequences of her actions, she discovered the possibility of genuine growth, a powerful transformation that would guide her every step forward. Ava Wallace stood outside the airplane's cockpit doorway, her heart pounding. A flurry of conflicting emotions washed over her, from fear and pride to a gnawing sense of disbelief that her carefully built career was crumbling. Around her, the hum of passengers settling into seats mixed with a tense silence, as if everyone was waiting for the next move. Only moments earlier, she had forced Claire Watson, an elderly passenger with a valid first-class ticket, off the aircraft. Now, Charles Watson, Claire's son, stood before her, demanding accountability for Ava's actions. Charles, tall and visibly upset, fixed his eyes on Ava. In his right hand, he clutched a phone that displayed the digital first-class ticket that belonged to his mother. "I need an explanation," he stated with forced calm. There was a quiet authority to his voice, one that came from being utterly convinced he was on the side of the truth. The senior flight attendant, a gray-haired woman named Marianne, hovered nearby, her brow creased with concern. Ava felt cornered. She could practically feel the judgment emanating from every direction. The glances of passengers and crew alike seemed to say, "How could you do this?" She cleared her throat, grappling for control. "Sir, I believed your mother was in the wrong seat," she began, mustering a hint of the professional tone she usually wielded so well. "I was following protocol for passengers who appear to be in the incorrect cabin." "Protocol?" Charles's voice rose. "Protocol is to check the passenger list and verify the seat number. It's not to throw someone off the plane without proof." In the periphery of her vision, Ava noticed a young woman holding up her cell phone, presumably filming the entire interaction. Others whispered among themselves. She felt a spike of panic. If this footage went online, she knew her reputation could be stained forever. Still, she clung to the hope that she might salvage her job and walk away with some dignity. The shadow of authority Marianne stepped forward, pressing her lips together in a tight line. "Charles, I've reviewed the manifest personally," she said, speaking to him but shooting Ava a meaningful glance. "Your mother absolutely belongs in first class. There's no mistake in that regard. I'm sorry for any inconvenience." Charles exhaled, but his gaze never left Ava. "I want my mother back on this plane, and I want a sincere apology for the way she's been treated." A short distance away, the pilot emerged from the cockpit to see what was happening. He wore a look of reluctant concern, as though he hated to become involved in passenger disputes. But this was no minor issue. He had received word that there was a serious situation brewing in the cabin. "What's going on?" he asked, folding his arms over his chest. Marianne swiftly explained the crux of the matter. Ava had incorrectly removed Claire Watson, a rightful first-class passenger, from the flight. The pilot's eyes hardened with disapproval as he processed the information. When he directed his attention to Ava, she felt a wave of shame course through her. Though she still wanted to defend herself, she also grasped the gravity of the error. Before Ava could speak, the pilot conferred quietly with Marianne, and both glanced at Charles. Ava's fate seemed to hinge on a few hushed words. Within moments, Marianne turned to Ava, her face solemn. "Ava Wallace, I'm sorry, but the airline has issued a directive. Your actions violated company policy to such a degree that we're compelled to relieve you of your duties immediately." Ava blinked, her mind struggling to register the finality in Marianne's tone. Are you saying I'm fired?" Marianne nodded, the sympathy on her face overshadowed by her professional resolve. "Yes. Effective immediately. We'll need you to gather your belongings." A hush fell across the first-class cabin. Charles, taken aback by how quickly the airline acted, simply stood in silence. Though he had wanted accountability, he hadn't expected Ava to lose her job on the spot. Several passengers watched, phones still raised, capturing the tension. Ava's chest felt tight, as if she could barely draw breath. Her sense of identity, wrapped so tightly in her uniform, threatened to snap like a brittle twig in a storm. No matter how braced she might have thought she was, nothing could prepare Ava for the humiliation that followed. A uniformed security officer, summoned by an airport official, boarded the plane to escort her away. A wave of shame kept Ava's gaze pinned to the floor, unable to meet the eyes of the watching passengers. She collected her airline ID and personal items from the galley. The walk down the aisle felt interminable, every step a public display of her downfall. Some passengers whispered among themselves, expressing sympathy or condemnation. Others simply looked away, uncomfortable witnessing such a raw moment. Ava's temples throbbed with the heat of embarrassment, and her limbs felt like lead. As she exited the aircraft, leaving behind the pressurized cabin that had been her domain, she heard the pilot's voice on the intercom, announcing a final boarding call for anyone still waiting. In the jet bridge, Ava's badge and any airline-issued materials were confiscated. Her travel privileges, once a point of pride, were revoked. A hollow space opened in her chest, threatening to swallow her whole. She glanced back, as though expecting someone, anyone, to intervene and assure her this was all a misunderstanding. But no such reprieve came. Once inside the terminal, two grim-faced airport officials stood by. One carried a small plastic bin where Ava was asked to place her airline-issued blazer and name tag. She pressed her lips into a thin line as she unpinned the tag, the metallic clink echoing like the final nail in her professional coffin. After removing the blazer, she handed it over, feeling abruptly exposed in just her white button-up shirt and dress pants. No longer a flight attendant, no longer in uniform, she looked to all the world like a lost traveler. The officials offered no solace. Their job was simply to process the termination. Within minutes, Ava was directed to leave the secured area of the airport altogether. Powerless to resist, she clutched her small carry-on bag, turned on her heel, and walked toward the exit, her footsteps heavy and uncertain. The moment Ava stepped into the bustling central hall of the airport, a kaleidoscope of emotions swirled within her: anger, shame, disbelief, and an underlying sense of grief for the career she had so abruptly lost. She lingered near a large window overlooking the tarmac, watching planes taxiing to and fro, reminders of a world she was suddenly barred from. For a fleeting moment, she recalled her earliest days as a trainee, the excitement she had felt at the prospect of helping people safely navigate the skies. Now, that chapter of her life was over. She turned away from the window, shoulders slumped. Each stride through the terminal felt surreal, as though she were in a dream from which she might soon awaken. The noise of rolling suitcases and chattering families pressed in on her, painfully reminding her that for everyone else, life went on as usual. Ava found a bench near the airport's rideshare pickup zone, sat down, and tried to compose herself. She pulled out her phone, its lock screen still showing a cheerful photo from a layover in Seattle, a place she had once visited frequently as part of her job. The memory cut deep. She scrolled through her contacts, half-heartedly looking for someone she could call for help or comfort. Her pride fought her every step of the way. She thought of her father, who had always told her never to let anyone push her around. But his words seemed painfully ironic now, for she had been the one pushing others around. She imagined her mother's disappointed face upon hearing how Ava had lost her job by mistreating a senior passenger. That shame made her stomach twist. Unsure of whom to turn to, she locked her phone and slipped it back into her bag. Reflections on the incident as she replayed the moment when she had challenged Claire Watson in first class, a sickening realization gnawed at her: she hadn't even checked the manifest before evicting the elderly woman. She had operated solely on assumptions and an inflated sense of authority. In one act, she had taken all her training, all her knowledge of proper procedure, and thrown it aside in favor of what she believed was control. Her mind flitted back to Claire's confused and frightened eyes. The older woman had looked so unsettled, clutching the ticket that Ava refused to acknowledge. An unspoken question rose to the surface of Ava's thoughts: had she harbored prejudice or a stereotype that someone like Claire couldn't possibly afford first class? The notion stung. She felt tears welling in her eyes, a mixture of regret and anger. Anger at herself, for being so blind and inflexible. Amid her spiraling thoughts, Ava hardly noticed someone approaching. A woman in casual clothes, eyes warm with concern, gently laid a hand on Ava's shoulder. "Excuse me," she said softly, "I saw what happened. Are you okay?" At first, Ava recoiled, not wanting to air her humiliation to a stranger. But she also recognized a genuine kindness in the woman's voice, an empathy she now craved more than ever. I'm not really sure," Ava admitted, her voice trembling. The woman introduced herself as Sandra, a frequent flyer who had recognized Ava from past flights. She'd been waiting in the terminal when the confrontation spilled out of the plane, and she witnessed Ava's meltdown from afar. "I know this is none of my business," Sandra said, "but if you need someone to talk to, I'm here. I travel a lot, and I've flown with you before. You always seem so put together." A bitter laugh escaped Ava's throat. "Looks are deceiving, I guess." She blinked back tears. Sandra's non-judgmental presence was both comforting and excruciating, shining a light on the mess Ava had created. They spoke briefly, with Ava giving a condensed version of what led to her immediate termination. Sandra listened without interrupting, her expression compassionate yet neutral. When Ava finished, Sandra offered a sad smile. "We all make mistakes. Some just carry heavier consequences than others." Ava nodded, feeling a wave of gratitude for Sandra's understanding, even if it was small solace. She knew she had to face the ramifications herself. A part of her wished she could just hop on a plane and run away, but that life was now off limits. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Ava realized she couldn't stay at the airport indefinitely. Every corner of the terminal was tinged with memories of her old routine. She thanked Sandra and, despite the stranger's kind offer of further help, politely declined. It felt too painful and too soon to accept charity or moral support from someone she barely knew. Instead, she walked to the rideshare pickup zone and requested a ride home. The short wait felt like an eternity. Her mind buzzed with the knowledge that she would have to make calls, to her parents, possibly to a lawyer, and definitely to the airline's human resources department to finalize paperwork. Her chest tightened at the thought of having to explain everything that happened. When the car arrived, she slipped into the back seat. Her reflection stared back from the side mirror, eyes red and tired, hair slightly disheveled from the day's turmoil. The driver asked if she was heading home, and Ava simply nodded, unable to muster more words. The lights of the airport receded behind them, replaced by the neon and headlights of the city outside. Ava clutched her bag, feeling as though she were leaving an entire life behind. A wave of emptiness washed over her. Her job, which had been so much more than a paycheck, was gone. Her uniform, a symbol of status and capability, was now in an airport locker. Most painful of all, she carried the crushing weight of having betrayed the very principles of service and care she was meant to uphold. By the time Ava arrived at her small apartment, the sky was dark. She dragged herself up the stairs and unlocked the door. The space was neat, a reflection of her meticulous personality. Yet now it felt like a stranger's home, devoid of the comforting promise that she'd be heading out on another flight in the morning. She set her carry-on bag in the corner and sank onto the couch. An eerie quiet enveloped her. There was no flight schedule to check, no uniform to press, no barrage of messages from the airline scheduling department. She tried turning on the TV for distraction, but the noise felt jarring, so she switched it off again. In the silence, she allowed the gravity of the day's events to settle in. She replayed every step of her confrontation with Claire Watson, replayed Charles Watson's outraged face, replayed Marianne's regretful voice announcing her termination. Each memory brought new waves of shame and regret. Yet beneath the turmoil, a tiny spark flickered. It was the realization that she could not continue living as she had. This painful moment, while devastating, might also be a turning point. Ava wondered if she could somehow transform the humiliation into a lesson, if she could learn to view people, not through the lens of her own assumptions, but with the empathy and respect they deserved. She let that thought linger in her mind, grasping it like a lifeline. Sleep would not come easily, but she curled up under a blanket anyway, phone set to silent, determined to face the consequences, whatever they might be, head-on when morning came. The following day dawned gray and drizzly, a fitting match for Ava Wallace's mood. She woke from restless sleep, the taste of yesterday's humiliation still bitter on her tongue. A knot of dread formed in her stomach as she glanced at her phone, half expecting an onslaught of missed calls or messages, but her screen was eerily silent. The airline had already cut ties, and no one else seemed to know what to say in the wake of her sudden downfall. Coping with reality, Ava pulled herself out of bed and went through the motions of a morning routine, a shower, a cup of coffee, and a glance at the news. Everything felt hollow. She wasn't getting ready for a flight, not scanning her email for updates from crew scheduling. She lingered on her couch, sipping coffee from a mug emblazoned with the airline's logo, an item that once filled her with pride. Now it was a reminder of what she had lost. A swirl of questions haunted her. How would she pay her rent? Could she salvage her professional reputation if the incident went viral online? What would her parents say when she finally mustered the courage to tell them she'd been fired for mistreating a passenger? Each question tightened the knot in her gut, sapping her energy. Tentative reaching out by late morning, Ava realized she couldn't just sit in silence. On her phone, she had the number of an old friend from training school, a man named Jonathan Perry, who had always been the calm voice of reason during their most hectic days. Though they hadn't spoken in months, she remembered how supportive he could be. She typed out a brief message, her fingers trembling. "Hey Jonathan, it's Ava. Something major happened, and I really need someone to talk to. Would you have time for a call?" She stared at the screen for a moment, her heart racing. Before she could overthink, she hit send. The sense of relief at having done something, anything, settled over her, but it was quickly replaced by a fresh wave of anxiety. What if he never replied? An hour later, her phone buzzed. Jonathan's reply was short but encouraging. "Hey, Ava. Sure, let's talk. Call me whenever you're ready." Ava inhaled deeply, steeling herself, then pressed the call button. Jonathan's familiar voice answered on the first ring, warm and calm as she remembered. They exchanged pleasantries before she finally recounted the entire ordeal, her confrontation with Claire Watson, the immediate termination, the humiliating escort off the plane. She glossed over no detail, determined to be transparent. Jonathan let out a low whistle when she finished. "That's rough," he said. "I won't lie, Ava, this is a big one. But it doesn't have to define you forever." A lump formed in Ava's throat. "I just feel so ashamed," she managed, voice trembling. "I embarrassed myself, and I hurt that woman for no reason other than my own assumption that she didn't belong in first class." Jonathan hesitated before responding. "From what you've told me, you let your authority get the better of you. I remember you were always proud of being good at enforcing the rules, but maybe sometimes you forgot the service part of customer service." Although his words stung, Ava couldn't deny the truth in them. She had prided herself on discipline and order, failing to balance them with empathy. "What do I do now?" she asked, her voice small. "I can't decide that for you," Jonathan replied. "But taking responsibility is the first step. People make mistakes, even big ones. It's how you respond afterward that matters." Seeking closure after their call, Ava sat in silence, replaying Jonathan's advice in her mind. Taking responsibility meant more than just admitting guilt to herself, it meant actively trying to make amends. She wondered if it was even possible to contact Claire Watson or her son Charles to apologize. The airline had severed all ties, so she couldn't rely on company channels. Yet the idea of leaving the matter unresolved gnawed at her. She felt a strong need to express remorse directly to Claire, to acknowledge the harm she had caused. Even if it wouldn't change what happened, perhaps it could allow both of them a measure of closure. She typed an email to the airline's customer service department, explaining who she was and asking if they could pass along a written apology to Claire Watson. Ava composed the message, careful to avoid self-justification. She wrote simply, "I made an inexcusable error in dismissing Claire Watson from a flight. My actions stemmed from assumptions and arrogance, not from any genuine safety concern. I accept full responsibility and wish to express my deepest regret for the distress I caused Mrs. Watson. If you have a way to contact her or her son, Charles, please forward this message." Hitting send left her shaky, but also oddly relieved. She had opened a door to accountability, even if she had no control over what lay on the other side. Rebuilding day by day over the next several days, Ava threw herself into the humbling process of re-examining her professional identity. She had been a flight attendant for several years, and before that, she was a college student uncertain about her future. Now, in her late 20s, she felt as though she had been stripped down to the bare essentials of who she was. She researched job opportunities, though her heart clenched at the thought of returning to any customer-facing role. Still, she recognized that was where her skill set resided. She reminded herself that not every company would judge her solely by one incident, though she also knew that if prospective employers asked about her departure from the airline, she'd have to be honest. Ava decided to apply for a few positions at smaller regional carriers, carefully crafting her resume to highlight her safety and service training. In the section for references, she placed Jonathan's name, hoping that his endorsement might carry some weight. Every time she clicked "Submit" on an application, her nerves flared, as though she was awaiting a verdict on her entire worth as a person. Despite her efforts, there were nights when Ava couldn't sleep, her mind plagued by images of Claire's startled face and the knowledge that dozens of passengers had witnessed her downfall. She often imagined the videos circulating on social media, complete with outraged comments labeling her everything from arrogant to heartless. On particularly bad evenings, she'd scroll through travel forums, searching to see if anyone had posted about the incident. A few threads mentioned a confrontation on a flight, describing a power-tripping flight attendant who had been fired on the spot. Though no one named her explicitly, the references were unmistakable. Each mention was like a fresh wound, reminding her that the world had seen her worst moment. Nearly 2 weeks passed, and Ava began to fear her apology email had disappeared into a corporate black hole. Then, one morning, she opened her inbox to find a response from the airline's customer service department. Her heart raced as she clicked to read the message. "Ms. Wallace, we have forwarded your apology to the Watson family as requested. While we cannot guarantee a response, we appreciate your willingness to take responsibility for the incident. Should Mrs. Watson or Mr. Watson choose to reply, we will be sure to pass it along to you. Sincerely, Airline Customer Care." Ava exhaled, mixed relief and renewed anxiety curling in her stomach. She set her phone aside, wondering if she would ever hear from Claire or Charles. If she did, how would she handle their anger? What if they wanted nothing more to do with her? Days continued to slip by without any word from the Watsons. Ava poured her efforts into personal improvement, signing up for an online course in conflict resolution and emotional intelligence. She devoured the coursework, determined to identify the blind spots that had led her to treat people so dismissively. Surprisingly, the lessons struck a chord. She learned about empathy mapping, active listening, and the consequences of unconscious biases. Each module felt painfully relevant, each concept reflecting mistakes she now recognized in herself. Although the course didn't undo what she'd done, it gave her tools to be better if she ever returned to a service profession. Meanwhile, Jonathan checked in regularly. Their conversations shifted from crisis counseling to personal growth. Some days were harder than others, but having one steadfast friend in her corner made a difference Ava couldn't overstate. Late on a Friday afternoon, as Ava was putting together a modest dinner, a notification lit up her phone. She glanced at the screen. The sender's address was unfamiliar, but the subject line read, "From Charles Watson." Her heart thudded. She set down the wooden spoon she was using to stir pasta sauce and tapped to open the message. Charles's email was concise: "Ms. Wallace, thank you for your apology. My mother, Claire, has read your message. She appreciates your willingness to admit fault and regrets the way things happened. Although this incident caused her considerable distress, she believes in second chances for those who genuinely seek to change. I won't pretend this makes everything okay, but I wanted you to know that we have received your apology and are willing to move on. My mother is recovering from the shock and has chosen to focus on her health rather than dwelling on this event. Please respect our privacy. We wish you well in taking the steps you need to become a better person. Sincerely, Charles Watson." Ava read it 3 times, tears pricking her eyes. She felt an immense weight lift from her chest. They had hurt her, and while they weren't offering open friendship or forgiveness in a personal sense, they were allowing her to lay down the burden of uncertainty. They were willing to move on, which, in turn, gave her permission to start moving on, too. A deeper reflection, she thought back to how she had responded when Claire first stepped onto the plane. In a matter of seconds, Ava had decided Claire didn't belong in first class, ignoring the physical ticket that proved otherwise. She remembered how she had swelled with a sense of righteous power, dictating who stayed and who left. Now, in the quiet of her apartment, she recognized that real service was never about wielding power. It was about meeting people where they were and helping them feel safe and respected. Closing her eyes, she pictured Claire's gentle face and Charles's outraged expression. They had every right to condemn her actions without mercy, but instead, they had offered the gift of acknowledgement. They had read her apology, accepted it for what it was, and chosen not to remain hostile. If they could move forward, perhaps so could she. The following week, Ava received a call from a small commuter airline that operated out of a nearby regional airport. They wanted to schedule an interview, explaining they were open to giving experienced but recently out-of-work flight attendants an opportunity, provided the applicants showed genuine willingness to learn and adhere to ethical standards of service. Ava was stunned. She had applied as a long shot, never imagining they would even consider her. Nerves fluttered in her stomach as she prepared for the interview. She decided not to hide what had happened at her previous job. Instead, she resolved to speak honestly about the incident, emphasizing what she had learned and the steps she was taking to ensure she never repeated such a mistake. The night before the interview, she barely slept, running possible questions through her head, determined to be transparent but also positive about her future. The interview took place via a video call. The panel consisted of 2 hiring managers and a representative from the airline's employee relations department. They asked pointed questions, and Ava answered them forthrightly. She spoke of the dangers of letting power override empathy, about her ongoing education in conflict resolution, and about her sincere remorse for the harm she had caused. Though she could see skepticism in one manager's face, the other 2 seemed impressed by her candor. When the interview wrapped, they thanked her and said they would be in touch soon. Ava breathed a sigh of relief the moment the call disconnected. It was out of her hands, but at least she'd had the chance to show she wasn't defined solely by her worst moment. Embracing accountability that evening, she ventured outside for a long walk in her neighborhood. The rain from earlier in the week had subsided, leaving the streets glistening under streetlights. She found herself reflecting on how everything had changed. Only a short time ago, she had considered herself untouchable, an enforcer of airline policies who could do no wrong. Today, she was humbler, perhaps even a better person for having learned humility. She wasn't entirely sure if she would be hired by this smaller airline. But she recognized something important: her worth wasn't contingent on whether she returned to the skies. What truly mattered was how she grew from the experience, whether she learned to treat people with genuine care and respect in every setting. Late that night, Ava settled onto her couch, wrapped in a cozy blanket. Outside, a few cars passed by, their headlights cutting through the darkness. She gazed at the half-packed boxes in her apartment. She had started preparing to move, just in case she needed a fresh environment. But a small part of her hoped she might stay, find her footing in the city she knew, and rebuild her life here. No matter what happened next, she resolved to continue owning her actions. She would not bury her mistake or pretend it had never happened. Rather, she would treat it as a guiding lesson, reminding her that service was about more than procedures and authority. It was about empathy and respect, particularly for those who seemed least likely to demand it. In the quiet hush of the night, Ava Wallace allowed herself a faint smile. By confronting her error and dedicating herself to growth, she felt a glimmer of self-respect returning. She still had a long road ahead, but perhaps for the first time in her life, she sensed a genuine purpose blossoming, the desire to use her experiences to become a kinder, more understanding person. With that thought, she switched off the lamp. Tomorrow was another day, filled with both uncertainty and possibility. And for once, she felt ready to face it. Ava Wallace leaned her forehead against the cool glass pane of her apartment window, staring out at the world that seemed so vibrant and alive without her. The city lights glowed in the dusk, and the flow of people on the sidewalks below hinted at countless individual stories unfolding, stories far removed from the personal crisis that she couldn't escape. Every day felt like a loop of the same regrets. She had been fired from her flight attendant position in the most public, humiliating way possible. Now, with her career in shambles, her self-confidence seemed to have vanished along with her uniform. When she pulled away from the window, her eyes fell on a framed photograph taken during her training days. She was standing with a group of fellow trainees, all bright smiles and starry-eyed ambition. They had been beaming for the camera, proud to have completed safety drills and emergency protocols. Ava's eyes lingered on each face, recognizing how full of promise and camaraderie they had all been. Now, many of those same colleagues still soared through the skies, posting pictures of exotic destinations, celebrating promotions, and living the life she had once embraced. Meanwhile, Ava felt erased, left behind to wrestle with her mistakes and an uncertain future. Weighing her sense of identity in the first weeks after her termination, Ava had tried to cling to daily routines, hoping a semblance of normalcy would keep her afloat. She still woke up early, as she had when she had flights scheduled. She still tidied her apartment with the precision of a flight attendant stowing galley carts. Yet each chore felt hollow. Without the purpose that came from serving passengers and ensuring their comfort, everything seemed performative, like a ritual for a role she no longer played. She began avoiding mirrors, unsettled by the reflection of a woman she barely recognized. There was a hollowness in her eyes that troubled her. Even more troubling was the stark realization that her sense of self had been so tightly woven into her job title. Now, that piece of her identity had been ripped away. On days when her phone chimed, she felt both hope and dread. Hope that it might be a recruiter with an unexpected offer, or perhaps a message from the airline saying they had reconsidered her dismissal. Dread that it could be another notification about a viral video capturing her worst moment, or that it might be her parents, wanting to discuss the fiasco she still couldn't adequately explain. She began silencing her phone out of self-preservation, choosing ignorance over the anxiety of constant monitoring. Watching others move on social media became a double-edged sword. Ava couldn't entirely resist scrolling through her feed, where snapshots of other flight attendants flooded her screen, group selfies in tropical layovers, enthusiastic passengers praising stellar service, and even brief glimpses of the airplane cabin she missed so much. Seeing these posts plunged her into bouts of self-doubt. She felt stuck at the starting line while everyone else sprinted ahead, forging new memories, collecting compliments, and receiving promotions. Compounding this sense of isolation was the fear that her friends and colleagues were deliberately distancing themselves from her. A few had sent quick messages of sympathy in the immediate aftermath of her firing, but as the weeks wore on, the silence grew. Perhaps they were busy with their own schedules. Perhaps they didn't know what to say. Or perhaps they disapproved of what she had done. No matter the reason, the distance left Ava feeling more powerless than ever, like she was watching life through a one-way mirror. Everyone moved freely on the other side, she was stuck, invisible, unable to make contact. Memories of the incident inevitably, Ava's thoughts circled back to the moment she had confronted Claire Watson on that fateful flight. She had replayed that scene so many times, Claire, ticket in hand, politely insisting she belonged in first class, and Ava, brimming with unwarranted certainty, dismissing her. The memory brought a twist of guilt in her gut. She had been so focused on exercising her authority that she hadn't paused to verify the details. And though she never intended to inflict emotional harm, her actions had done precisely that. The feeling of being powerless now seemed like karmic retribution for the times she had wielded power without empathy. At night, she would sit in the dim glow of her living room, arms wrapped around her knees, recalling the humiliation of being publicly escorted off the plane. Passengers had recorded her with their phones, some aiming them at her like she was an exhibit to be gawked at. She remembered how the gate agents had confiscated her ID, how she had walked alone into the airport terminal, stripped of the uniform that once symbolized her competence and pride. Reliving it all triggered bursts of shame, like picking at an old wound that refused to heal. The lingering consequences, the tangible consequences of her termination grew increasingly clear. Bills arrived in her mailbox with the same relentless regularity they always had, but her bank balance was no longer replenished by direct deposits from the airline. She tried skimming job listings, only to feel paralyzed by the question of how she would explain her sudden departure from her old position. In interviews, employers often asked why she left the airline, and though she wanted to be honest, the conversation usually stalled once she admitted the real reason. Her landlord, Mr. Benson, noticed her stress. He was an older gentleman who had always seemed kindly but distant, rarely prying into his tenants' affairs. One afternoon, when Ava stepped out to grab her mail, he passed her in the hallway. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice lined with genuine concern. Ava gave a strained smile. "Yes, thank you," she lied. A flicker of doubt crossed his features, but he nodded politely and left her in peace. She retreated into her apartment, anxious about whether she'd be able to keep paying her rent, unsure how long Mr. Benson's sympathy would last if she fell behind. The sense of dread only intensified each time she checked her dwindling savings. Feeling erased with each day that passed, Ava felt as though she was evaporating from the social circles she had once inhabited. She was no longer receiving airline updates or union newsletters. Her ID no longer opened the staff lounge door, a place that used to feel like a second home. Even her uniform, packed away in a box at the back of her closet, seemed like a relic from a previous life. If she scrolled back far enough on her phone's camera roll, she found countless photos capturing the high points of her old job, scenic shots from plane windows, camaraderie with fellow crew members, and smiling passengers who had appreciated her help. Now, it felt like those memories belonged to someone else. When she ventured outside for errands or a walk, she found herself unconsciously scanning the skies at the sound of passing aircraft. A pang of longing would stab through her chest, coupled with the haunting thought that she didn't belong up there anymore. Her dreams at night often featured her in the cabin, instructing passengers to fasten seatbelts or stow trays, only to realize mid-flight that she had lost her authority. In those dreams, the passengers stared at her blankly, as though she was a ghost who didn't exist at all. Doubt took hold in every corner of Ava's mind. She questioned whether she had ever truly been meant for the airline industry. Had she been an imposter all along, chasing the glamour of the job rather than its true essence? That thought left her torn between self-pity and a desperate wish to prove she was capable of learning from her mistakes. She avoided telling her parents about the full scope of her termination for as long as she could. Their periodic phone calls were filled with half-truths and evasions. "Yes, things are a bit slow at work," she'd say vaguely, or "I'm thinking of exploring other opportunities." She knew she couldn't keep the facade forever, but she kept postponing the inevitable. Each day, she promised herself she would tell them tomorrow. Late one evening, she tried to distract herself by browsing online job boards. The listings blurred together: retail cashier, front desk clerk, hospitality manager. She clicked on each with wavering interest. Then she saw a post for an airline lounge attendant, a customer service role located in the airport, but grounded rather than in the skies. Her heart fluttered. It was a small glimmer of hope, an opportunity to stay connected to aviation in some capacity. But as soon as she began filling in the application, she imagined the hiring manager's face as they asked why she'd left her last job. Her fingers froze over the keyboard. As the days dragged by, the sensation of being powerless weighed on Ava like a heavy coat she couldn't shrug off. She saw no clear path forward and felt as though her efforts to stand up again were thwarted by her own guilt and fear. She recognized she had made a grievous error, but she was unsure how to move beyond it, how to stop feeling defined by that single moment on the plane. Memories of her old colleagues haunted her. She thought of their tight-knit bonds and worried that she had lost more than just a job, that she had lost a surrogate family. At times, she blamed herself for never forging deeper friendships, for always maintaining a strict professional facade. Maybe if she had been more open, someone would have reached out by now to check on her or offer help. Every so often, she replayed Charles Watson's confrontation in her mind. He had spoken on behalf of his mother, radiating righteous anger at Ava's assumption that Claire didn't belong in first class. The intensity of his defense underscored a truth Ava could no longer deny, that caring for passengers was a sacred responsibility. By treating Claire as an inconvenience, Ava had betrayed the core value of customer care. Recognizing this made her realize that her sense of powerlessness was not just about losing her job. It was about confronting who she had been in that moment, and that self-image was not easy to reconcile. There came a day when Ava simply couldn't bear her own self-pity any longer. She was tidying her kitchen when she dropped a glass, which shattered on the tile floor. As she swept up the shards, she was struck by the parallel to her own situation. She felt just as fragmented as those pieces of glass, broken apart by a single careless action. But unlike the glass, she wasn't irreparable. She set the broom aside, sank into a chair, and stared at the fragments in the dustpan. "I'm still here," she whispered to herself. The sound of her own voice in the quiet apartment startled her. It was a small declaration, but it carried an unexpected weight. Yes, she had lost her job. Yes, she felt humiliated, erased, and powerless. But she was still a living, breathing person, capable of reflection, capable of change. In that moment, a spark of determination flared. She couldn't expect the world to give her a sense of power or purpose. She had to find it within herself. She had to build it, piece by piece, just as if she were reconstructing a shattered glass. It wouldn't be the same as before, perhaps, but it could still hold water, or in her case, hope. That night, Ava allowed herself to dream a little. She pulled out her notebook, normally used for shopping lists, and began jotting down ideas about what she might do next. Most of them were scribbled phrases or single words: customer service training, online classes, volunteer work, speak to a counselor. She had no clear direction, but it felt empowering just to put pen to paper and acknowledge that her future could take multiple forms. She even dared to consider reaching out to some of her old airline friends. Part of her doubted they would respond, but perhaps one or two might offer guidance or at least a listening ear. By the time she closed her notebook, she felt a fragile sense of purpose germinating inside her. Of course, the despair didn't vanish overnight. She still woke in the mornings grappling with an undercurrent of sadness, reminded of her plight every time she glanced at the uniform box in her closet. But the difference was that she had begun to see a way forward. She had started to believe that feeling powerless wasn't a life sentence, it was a phase she could outgrow. In the days that followed, she filled out more job applications, making a point to be honest about why she'd left her previous role. Rejections came swiftly, often in the form of automated emails. Yet each time she didn't get a position, she refused to let it plunge her back into paralyzing despair. Instead, she learned to treat each rejection as a stepping stone, another piece in the puzzle of her redefined identity. She still had a journey ahead, and she knew it. But for the first time since the plane incident, Ava felt a subtle but unmistakable shift. No longer merely an observer in her own life, she was taking small steps to reclaim her sense of self. Even if the world seemed to be moving on without her, she could decide how she wanted to move forward in it, bit by bit. On a chilly morning, about a month after her dramatic termination, Ava Wallace sat at her small dining table, nursing a lukewarm cup of tea and contemplating the series of events that had derailed her life. She had begun the day by rereading the notes she'd scrawled in her notebook, the bullet points about volunteering, continuing education, and reaching out to old contacts. While most of them remained just words on a page, one in particular tugged at her thoughts: the notion of contacting a former colleague for advice. Jonathan Perry, a friend from her flight attendant training days, was the one person who had consistently offered a supportive ear. But there were others too, like her old mentor from in-flight service, Samantha Beckett, a senior flight attendant with years of experience handling sensitive passenger issues. While Ava had lost touch with Samantha, she remembered Samantha's emphasis on empathy and gentleness, a stark contrast to the rigid approach Ava had sometimes taken. After finishing her tea, Ava decided she would try to contact Samantha. Perhaps Samantha wouldn't respond, or perhaps she would respond with anger at hearing about Ava's disgrace. But the idea of reconnecting with someone who had once guided her felt oddly reassuring. She pulled out her phone and scrolled until she found Samantha's number buried in an old contact list. Heart pounding, she typed out a short, honest text, "Hi Samantha, it's Ava Wallace. I know it's been a while. I wanted to reach out because I've been going through a tough time and could really use some advice. If you're open to it, I'd love to talk." With trembling fingers, Ava hit send, then placed her phone face down on the table, nerves already bracing for silence or rejection. A glimmer of hope to her surprise, Samantha responded an hour later, "Ava, hi. I heard about what happened, and I'm sorry you're going through such a difficult period. I'm happy to talk. Call me when you can." Encouraged by Samantha's warmth, Ava immediately called. Hearing Samantha's voice felt like stepping into a safe harbor after being lost at sea. They exchanged brief pleasantries before Ava dove into the turmoil she'd been experiencing, her regret over mistreating Claire Watson, her subsequent termination, her sense of isolation, and her struggle to find direction. On the other end of the line, Samantha listened quietly. "Ava, you and I both know that flight attendants work under a lot of pressure. But that doesn't excuse what happened. You crossed a line by forcing someone off the plane without verifying facts. That said, nobody is beyond redemption. What matters is how you learn from it." Ava swallowed hard, appreciative of Samantha's candor. "I want to make it right," she said. "I tried emailing an apology through customer service. I even got a note back from Claire's son, Charles, saying they accepted my apology. But I still feel like a pariah." Samantha's voice softened. "People will move on, Ava. If you genuinely change your approach to service and empathy, this doesn't have to define you forever." They spoke for over an hour. Samantha suggested books on conflict resolution, recommended a local community college that offered evening classes in hospitality management, and urged Ava to find a constructive outlet, perhaps volunteering at a senior center, where she might come face to face with people like Claire. "It could be healing," Samantha said gently. "Sometimes the best way to learn empathy is by serving those who need kindness the most." Ava ended the call feeling a cautious sense of optimism. She had been spinning in circles for weeks, stuck between shame and indecision. Now, Samantha's suggestions offered a roadmap of possibilities. Ava grabbed her notebook, writing down everything they had discussed. She realized that reclaiming her story wouldn't come from hiding her error but from confronting it head-on. Her first step was to register for a continuing education course at the local community college. The class on hospitality management and customer engagement would begin in a couple of weeks, and though a part of her bristled at the thought of going back to school, she saw no better way to develop skills she had clearly neglected. She filled out the online forms, paid the registration fee with what remained of her savings, and committed to this new path. Seeking volunteer work. The idea of volunteering at a senior center both intrigued and frightened Ava. She recalled Claire Watson's confusion and how she dismissed her as someone who didn't belong in first class. Working directly with seniors might force her to face the biases she hadn't admitted to having. Yet Samantha's words echoed in her mind, "Sometimes the best way to learn empathy is by serving those who need kindness the most." Ava did some quick research and found a local retirement community, Meadowview Lodge, that welcomed volunteers to read to residents, host small activities, or simply offer companionship. She completed the online volunteer application and waited, heart thrumming with nerves. What if they found out about her past? Would they reject her? Within a few days, she got an email inviting her to an orientation. Despite lingering anxiety, she accepted the invitation. On the morning of her orientation, she dressed in modest business casual clothes, took a bus across town, and arrived at Meadowview Lodge, a sprawling complex with meticulously kept gardens and a warm, inviting lobby. The volunteer coordinator, a cheerful woman named Denise, greeted Ava with a smile. Together, they walked through the bright corridors, stopping to chat with residents who lingered in common areas or nursed cups of tea in the reading nook. Ava was struck by how open and eager for conversation many of the older folk seemed. She wondered if Claire Watson might have been just like them, dignified, interesting, and deserving of respect, a person with a lifetime of stories waiting to be heard. First encounters after the orientation, Denise introduced Ava to a small group of residents gathered in a sunlit room filled with potted plants. An elderly woman, Mary, immediately beckoned Ava to sit beside her. A retired teacher, Mary spoke enthusiastically about her decades in the classroom. Ava listened, nodding and asking questions. She found herself surprisingly comfortable in the role of a curious audience, letting Mary reminisce without interruption. When Ava mentioned she had once been a flight attendant, the group lit up with enthusiasm, peppering her with questions about airplane travel, safety demonstrations, and international layovers. Ava hesitated, not wanting to lie, but also not wanting to delve into her recent firing. She navigated around the topic, offering funny anecdotes from her time in the skies without revealing its disgraceful end. In that moment, she discovered how much she enjoyed connecting with people. She felt a sense of satisfaction in seeing the residents' eyes sparkle with interest, as if her stories transported them to destinations they might never see in person. It occurred to her that this was what she had originally loved about being a flight attendant, bridging gaps, creating comfort, and ensuring others felt heard and cared for. Confronting personal shortcomings, however, the next week brought a challenging encounter. One of the residents, Mr. Saunders, was grumpy and impatient, complaining about everything from the brightness of the lights to the taste of the coffee. He eyed Ava with suspicion when she tried to help him move from his wheelchair to a recliner. "I can do it myself," he snapped, glaring at her. Ava felt a pang of annoyance rise within her, an echo of the old reflex to assert authority. But she caught herself. Instead of insisting he follow her instructions, she paused, took a breath, and asked, "Is there a way I can assist you without getting in your way?" Mr. Saunders eyed her, then grunted a half-hearted answer. Following his lead, Ava helped him shift his position at his own pace. It was a small victory of patience over pride. Afterward, as she tidied the reading area, she realized she was testing the new empathy she was trying to cultivate. This was the real work, pushing back against her old tendency to control situations, especially when she felt challenged. Checking in with Samantha. A couple of weeks passed. Ava's volunteering at Meadowview Lodge became a regular commitment, and her evening class at the community college had begun in earnest. Balancing these two activities gave structure to her days, a sense of progress she had sorely missed. Late one evening, she called Samantha again to update her. "I'm glad to hear you're diving into volunteer work," Samantha said. "And the class at the college, how's that going?" Ava hesitated, considering how best to describe it. "It's eye-opening. The first session was all about emotional intelligence and understanding customers' needs. We talked a lot about how service industries are built on empathy. Honestly, it feels like it was written just for me." She could practically hear Samantha's smile through the phone. "That's good. Keep going, Ava. It sounds like you're on the right track, even if it's going to take time." Despite these positive steps, Ava still wrestled with her lingering shame. Every so often, she'd be jarred by an unexpected reminder of her past mistake. Once, while scrolling online, she stumbled on a post about disgruntled airline employees. Though her own incident wasn't mentioned by name, the stories triggered flashbacks of her public dismissal. Her chest tightened and her palms went clammy. She closed the web page quickly, but the resurgence of guilt lingered. In these moments, she remembered Charles Watson's email acknowledging her apology. She had printed out his words and tucked them into a drawer, like a quiet promise that at least one piece of the puzzle had been addressed. Claire Watson had accepted her remorse. The thought comforted Ava enough to push her forward, even when insecurities reared up. She also took solace in the slow, steady improvements she noticed in her volunteer work. Where she once might have been impatient with a recalcitrant resident, she now offered a listening ear. Where she once might have judged someone based on appearance or assumptions, she forced herself to ask questions instead. Step by step, she was learning that kindness and understanding were far more potent, and far more rewarding, than exerting authority. Eventually, Ava mustered the courage to explain her situation fully to her parents. Over a video call one weekend, she recounted the conflict that led to her termination, leaving out no detail. As expected, there were tears and dismay, but there was also a surprising measure of empathy. Her mother shook her head, eyes glistening. "I wish you'd told us earlier, honey. We're disappointed in what happened, but we love you. And we want to see you stand back up from this." Her father's voice was gentle but firm. "I'm glad you're taking responsibility. You can't change the past, but you can shape what comes next." Hearing their support lifted a heavy burden from Ava's chest. She had feared condemnation; instead, she received a willingness to help. Her parents even offered to cover a month's rent if she found herself unable to manage her bills. Although she was reluctant to accept financial aid, their offer reminded her she wasn't alone. She had a safety net of people who wanted to see her learn and grow. In her hospitality management class, Ava began applying her volunteer experiences to class discussions. When the instructor asked students to share stories of dealing with difficult clients or customers, Ava spoke of her encounters at Meadowview Lodge. She described Mr. Saunders' prickly demeanor and how she'd found success by letting him maintain control over his personal space. The instructor commended her for turning a potential power struggle into a situation of mutual respect. One evening, the class topic focused on narrative reclamation, the idea that each customer interaction is part of a larger story. Ava realized she had to reclaim her own narrative. Her past mistake was part of her story, but it didn't have to be the final chapter. By volunteering, studying, and practicing empathy, she was essentially rewriting the script, forging a new identity as someone dedicated to respectful service rather than authoritarian enforcement. A milestone conversation near the end of her volunteer shift one Friday afternoon. Ava was preparing to leave Meadowview Lodge when she bumped into a visitor in the hallway, a middle-aged woman helping her father shuffle along. The woman looked flustered, juggling a bag, a jacket, and a set of keys. Ava politely offered assistance. The woman hesitated but allowed Ava to hold the bag so she could better support her dad. Once the father was settled, the woman turned to Ava, gratitude filling her eyes. "Thank you so much. You have no idea how helpful that was." Ava felt a small surge of warmth. "I'm just glad I could help." "Are you new here?" "Yes, my dad just moved in last week. I'm trying to make sure he's comfortable, but it's all so overwhelming." She exhaled, frazzled but relieved. In that moment, Ava was struck by how different it felt to offer help freely, with no hint of condescension or power dynamics. She was simply a person lending a hand. The authenticity of the exchange reassured her that she was moving toward the version of herself she'd always wanted to be, someone whose authority, if she ever had it again, would be grounded in genuine care rather than rigid control. Looking to the future that weekend, Ava spent hours updating her resume. She included her volunteer work, her ongoing hospitality management course, and a reference to Samantha, who agreed to vouch for her progress. She no longer felt the need to conceal her past mistake in shame. Instead, she framed it honestly. She had left the airline after a conflict with a passenger due to a lapse in professional judgment, and she was actively working to rectify her shortcomings through education and community engagement. When she was finished, she looked at her resume with a cautious sense of pride. Every word on it reflected who she was becoming. She might not return to the skies immediately, or ever, but she was forging a new path, one grounded in empathy, respect, and self-awareness. In her heart, she recognized the profound shift that had taken place. She was no longer just lamenting her loss, she was building something new from the wreckage. Before heading to bed, she sent off a round of applications for a variety of customer service roles, from hotel front desks to airport lounge positions. She understood the interviews would be challenging, and prospective employers might question her past. But she felt ready to own her story. As she clicked "Submit" on the final application, she reflected on a truth that had crystallized over the past weeks: the job she once held had never really been about wielding authority or controlling passengers. It had always been about service, humility, and a genuine desire to make people comfortable and safe while traveling. She had lost sight of that. Now, she was determined not to repeat that mistake, no matter where life took her next. In that resolve lay her turning point, a shift from regret toward rebirth, from self-doubt toward a newfound respect for the power of kindness and empathy. Whatever came next, Ava felt certain she would meet it with open eyes and an open heart. These parts continue Ava's story, detailing her deepening despair, her volunteer work to confront her biases, and her growing determination to reclaim her own narrative and sense of purpose. Ava Wallace woke before her alarm, heart thumping with anticipation. Today marked the launch of a new chapter in her slow but steady climb from the lowest point in her life. The day prior, she had accepted a front desk position at a modest hotel nestled just a few miles from the airport. It was her first real job offer since her termination as a flight attendant. Though the role didn't involve flying, it allowed her to use her hospitality skills while learning to serve others in a more grounded setting. A nervous start after showering and dressing in the simple, navy blue suit she'd purchased at a thrift store, Ava double-checked herself in the mirror. No more airline uniform. No wings pinned to her lapel. Instead, she wore a standard name tag. A quiet wave of nostalgia washed over her, but she steadied herself. This job wasn't about prestige or status. It was about service, a word that had gained deeper meaning for her over the last few months. She arrived at the hotel lobby with 20 minutes to spare, smoothing the front of her blazer as she crossed the threshold. The scent of fresh coffee and the muted hum of early morning guests welcomed her. The manager, a tall woman named Linda Brady, greeted her warmly. "Good morning, Ava," Linda said, offering a handshake. "We're glad you're here. Let's get you settled behind the front desk." Though Ava's palms felt clammy, she nodded, grateful for Linda's calm demeanor. She had been honest with Linda during the interview about her past mistake. To her relief, Linda had focused on Ava's willingness to learn and her references from volunteer work. Now, standing behind the polished counter, Ava inhaled slowly, preparing herself for her first day. Embracing humble beginnings, Linda introduced Ava to the team, a couple of front desk associates, a bellhop, and the housekeeping supervisor. Each greeted Ava with polite smiles. None showed the judgment or skepticism Ava had feared. Perhaps they were simply too busy to dwell on her backstory, or perhaps they believed, as Linda did, in second chances. As the first guests of the morning trickled in to check out, Ava forced herself to focus on small acts of genuine kindness, greeting people by name, asking if they'd enjoyed their stay, and offering to arrange transportation if needed. The task seemed mundane compared to the thrill of taking flight, but she found satisfaction in getting them right. Unlike her old self, who might have seen these repetitive tasks as beneath her. She now recognized that every interaction was a chance to practice empathy. A few hours into her shift, she paused to watch a child tug on her father's coat, pointing to the breakfast bar. The father, bleary-eyed, tried to juggle luggage and a phone conversation. Sensing his struggle, Ava stepped away from the counter momentarily to direct them to a nearby bench so they could sort everything out. She even offered to keep an eye on the luggage while the father grabbed a pastry for his son. The father shot her a grateful smile. "Thank you so much," he breathed. Ava felt a small surge of warmth, remembering how, not so long ago, she had done the exact opposite for Claire Watson, assuming rather than assisting. This time, she was determined to be of help, not hindrance. Revisiting old wounds. Ava's first week at the hotel proved both promising and challenging. On the one hand, she quickly mastered the reservation system, checked guests in and out smoothly, and handled typical front desk inquiries. On the other hand, she discovered how vulnerable she still felt when confronted with demanding or impatient guests. One business traveler, running late for a meeting, snapped at her about a billing issue. Her initial instinct was to snap back, to assert her position. But she took a breath, steadied herself, and calmly worked to resolve the problem instead. Later that evening, as she was locking up the desk for the night, Linda stopped by to check in. "How are you feeling about the role?" she asked, sliding a keycard into her pocket. Ava forced a small smile. "It's going well. I'm learning a lot." Linda nodded, then studied Ava more closely. "You have a knack for detail, but sometimes it looks like you've got something on your mind. If there's anything bothering you, let me know. We value honesty here." Though tempted to brush off Linda's concern, Ava couldn't ignore the earnestness in her voice. "Thank you," she said. "I appreciate that. Maybe I'm just trying to make sure I don't repeat old mistakes." Linda gave a sympathetic nod. "Understood. We all have moments we regret. The key is figuring out how to grow from them, right?" Ava felt a swell of gratitude. "Absolutely," she agreed, grateful for Linda's open approach. Unexpected encounters. Not long after she settled into her new routine, Ava was flipping through the reservations list one afternoon when a familiar name leaped out at her: Jonathan Perry. He had once been her classmate in flight attendant training and had provided advice when her crisis first unfolded. She hadn't seen him in person since her dismissal. According to the booking, he planned to stay at the hotel for 2 nights. Curiosity warred with anxiety. Would Jonathan look at her differently now that she was behind a front desk instead of 30,000 feet in the air? Although she knew Jonathan to be kind, she couldn't shake the fear that he might pity her or treat her as a cautionary tale. When Jonathan finally arrived, Ava was in the midst of checking in another guest. She spotted him in the corner of her eye, standing politely to the side, a small grin on his face. He waited until she was free, then stepped forward. "Ava. It's good to see you." She let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "You too," she replied, returning his grin. "Let's get you checked in." While she tapped at the keyboard, Jonathan leaned on the counter, his expression light. "So, this is the new gig?" "Yup," Ava said. "Front desk associate, at your service." "I'm glad you found something," he said softly, catching the nuance in her voice. "I mean it. You look calmer, actually." Ava paused, considering. "I feel calmer," she admitted. "Still sorting a lot out, but this job has been a good step." They made plans to catch up later for coffee. Even that small social promise felt like a milestone, a sign that she wasn't entirely cut off from her old life. Brewing doubts. Though Jonathan's visit gave Ava a boost, she couldn't silence the occasional, nagging question in her mind: was she settling for less than what she could achieve? Sometimes, as she watched airplanes cruising overhead, she missed the thrill of being airborne. Yet she also recalled the humiliation of her dismissal and the sting of losing a job she'd loved for all the wrong reasons. Perhaps it was better to ground herself, both literally and figuratively, until she fully understood how to treat people with the respect they deserved. In her weekly phone check-in with Samantha Beckett, her former mentor, Ava confessed her mixed feelings. "I still miss flying," she admitted. "But I'm afraid if I try to go back to aviation too soon, I'll fall into old habits. Then again, am I just running from my passion?" On the other end of the line, Samantha paused. "It's natural to miss the aspects of a job you once cherished," she said gently. "But you're wiser now. It might be worth exploring opportunities in aviation again, just not before you feel genuinely ready. Don't rush it, Ava. Growth doesn't happen overnight." A helping hand from the past. That same week, Ava's phone buzzed with a message from Charles Watson. Initially, her stomach flipped, worried that maybe something else had gone wrong, or that Claire was upset again. But the text was surprisingly neutral. "Hello, Ava. This is Charles. Hope you're well. Wanted to let you know Mom is doing much better health-wise. She mentioned you once, she wondered if you'd found a new path. I just thought I'd check in." Ava's heart pounded. Claire Watson, her former passenger, the woman she'd so unfairly removed from first class, was still thinking about her. Something about that warmed Ava's chest, even as it reminded her of her past failing. "Thank you for letting me know," she replied. "I'm doing okay. I have a new job at a hotel, learning to be a better person every day. Give her my best. And thank you for reaching out, it means a lot." Charles sent a quick acknowledgement, and that was the end of the conversation. Yet it lingered in Ava's thoughts for days. That Claire and Charles had extended any level of consideration to her seemed incredible. Maybe they truly believed she could grow from her mistake. Meanwhile, Ava's commitment to the senior center, Meadowview Lodge, continued, though she scaled back from multiple weekly visits to a single Saturday afternoon. Her new work schedule demanded more of her time, but she remained determined to maintain a connection to the residents. They had become a grounding influence in her life, reminding her of the importance of genuine compassion. During one visit, she noticed Mr. Saunders, the prickly resident who often argued about everything from meal choices to activity schedules, sitting alone in a corner, glowering at a television he hadn't bothered to turn on. Instead of avoiding him, Ava approached with a gentle question, "Mind if I sit with you?" He shrugged. "Suit yourself." Ava lowered herself into a chair. They watched the silent screen for a while, an easy quiet forming between them. Eventually, Mr. Saunders flicked the TV on with the remote, and a game show popped up. He muttered something about how the contestants never knew any answers. Ava just chuckled. "You must know a lot of answers, then," she teased lightly. "Humph," he grunted, but a flicker of a smile tugged at his lips. They watched for a few minutes more, exchanging the occasional comment about the ridiculous nature of trivia questions. As unremarkable as the moment seemed, it was a small breakthrough, an unspoken understanding that Ava was there not to boss him around, but to share a moment of companionship. Building a new sense of worth by the end of the month, Ava found herself falling into a manageable rhythm, morning shifts at the hotel, her college course in hospitality management on select evenings, and a volunteering slot on Saturdays. The swirl of activity left her little time to ruminate on her mistakes, but more importantly, it gave her a fresh sense of purpose. Each day, she encountered people who depended on her kindness, efficiency, and willingness to listen. She also discovered something unexpected. A growing confidence in her ability to handle difficult personalities. She wasn't the same person she had been as a flight attendant. When faced with a complaint or a tense situation at the hotel, she drew upon the empathy she'd been cultivating. She asked questions, listened carefully, and looked for ways to solve problems without resorting to demands or assumptions. More often than not, guests left the front desk feeling heard rather than dismissed. Still, at the back of her mind, Ava felt a tug toward the sky. She was in a better place emotionally, steadier, more grounded, but she couldn't deny that the allure of flying remained. She wondered if she might someday apply to a different airline, perhaps one smaller and more regionally focused, where she could prove she'd learned her lesson. She voiced these thoughts to Jonathan one afternoon when they met for coffee. They sat in a cafe near the hotel, sipping lattes amid the bustling crowd. "I just don't want to rush," Ava said, tapping her cup's lid. "But I also don't want to let fear hold me back. Maybe in a year or two, I could give it another shot." Jonathan nodded slowly. "You've done a lot of growing. If you think you can bring that growth back to aviation, then yeah, maybe it's worth a try. On the other hand, if you find joy in this hotel role, there's no shame in building a career here. The question is, what feels right to you?" Ava mulled over his words. She realized that, for the first time, she wasn't driven by a desperate need to validate herself through a prestigious uniform or job title. She wanted to choose a path that aligned with who she was becoming, someone who cared more about genuine service than about power or image. That evening, Ava walked home from her shift under a sky painted with the last streaks of sunset. She tipped her head back, watching an airplane's lights blink across the darkening horizon. A familiar pang of longing fluttered in her chest, but it was no longer laced with self-loathing. Instead, it felt like a gentle reminder of where she'd been, and how much she had changed. She recalled the final words of Linda's training session that day: "The heart of hospitality is respect for every person who walks in the door." Those words echoed in her mind, reminding her that every day was another chance to embody empathy and respect, whether she was checking in guests at a hotel, helping seniors at Meadowview Lodge, or, one day, possibly guiding passengers through the aisles of an airplane once again. Although Ava's future remained uncertain, she sensed that she was building something real, an inner framework of humility, compassion, and genuine dedication to the comfort of others. And that, she reflected, was the truest form of power she could ever possess. A crisp morning breeze swept through the hotel courtyard as Ava Wallace waited for the city bus, clutching a small folder of documents close to her chest. Inside the folder was a letter of recommendation from her volunteer coordinator at Meadowview Lodge, plus notes from her instructor praising her progress in the hospitality management course. Ava had an appointment later that day with a career counselor, a meeting she hoped would help her determine if, and when, she might return to aviation. The career counselor's office, the Career Counseling Center, was housed in a tidy brick building near the community college. Ava stepped into a cozy waiting area filled with potted plants and motivational posters. A friendly receptionist guided her to an office at the end of a corridor, where a counselor named Patricia greeted her warmly. Patricia had soft features and a calm, measured tone. After the initial introductions, she invited Ava to share her story and goals. Ava took a breath and recounted the highlights. Losing her flight attendant position due to a mistaken judgment call, wrestling with guilt, volunteering at a senior center, working front desk at a hotel, and now wondering whether it was time to consider re-entering the airline industry. Patricia listened thoughtfully. "Let's talk about what's important to you," she began. "What aspects of your old job did you genuinely love, and which parts weren't serving you well?" Ava surprised herself by how readily she answered. "I loved interacting with passengers, making them comfortable, and traveling. But I realize now I let the authority go to my head. I focused on control instead of care." "Understood," Patricia replied, jotting notes. "So, you want to maintain the positive aspects of flight while avoiding the pitfalls you fell into before. We can explore options that incorporate those strengths: service, hospitality, and empathy, while being mindful of your past experiences." Patricia presented a few potential paths, continuing in hotel hospitality. Ava had shown promise in her front desk role, and she could climb the ranks to become a manager, event coordinator, or even a corporate trainer for large hotel chains. Transitioning to airport ground services. She could consider working in ticketing, gate assistance, or special passenger support, roles that involved direct interaction but stayed on the ground. Reapplying to airlines. Although it might be challenging to explain her past termination, certain carriers might give her a second chance if she demonstrated her growth and had strong references. Ava felt both excitement and apprehension as Patricia laid out these paths. She recalled Samantha's advice not to rush back into flying and Linda's emphasis on honesty. "I think I'm leaning toward reapplying to airlines someday," Ava admitted, "but not until I feel certain I can handle the responsibility with the right mindset." Patricia nodded. "That's wise. In the meantime, continue building your skill set and your track record of positive interactions. You might also want to gather letters of recommendation from people who've seen your transformation firsthand." A jolt from the past. The next day, as Ava was going about her shift at the hotel, she spotted a figure in the lobby that made her heart skip a beat: Mary Ann, the senior attendant who had once overseen her on the airline. Mary Ann was chatting amiably with a colleague, dressed in casual clothes rather than a flight uniform. Ava hesitated, unsure whether to approach. Their last encounter had been fraught with tension. Marianne was the one who had to inform Ava of her termination. Mustering courage, Ava approached. "Marianne," she ventured, voice slightly shaky. Marianne turned, her eyes widening in recognition. A flurry of emotions flickered across her face, surprise, then warmth. "Ava, hello. I wasn't expecting to see you here." "I work at the front desk," Ava explained. "It's good to see you. How have you been?" Marianne smiled. "I'm well, thanks. I'm in town visiting family. We decided to stay here for a couple of nights." She studied Ava for a moment. "And how are you? I've wondered how you were doing after everything." Ava felt a pang of remorse. She decided to be direct. "I'm learning a lot. I volunteer at a senior center, and I'm taking classes in hospitality management. I'm trying to understand where I went wrong before, and how to fix it." Marianne's features softened. "I see. Good. That day on the plane was rough for everyone. I'm glad you're finding your way." Ava swallowed, heart pounding. "I'm sorry," she blurted. "I'm sorry for putting you in that position. You had to deliver the news that I was fired, and I know it wasn't easy for you either." Marianne nodded, an empathetic sadness in her eyes. "We all have rules to follow, and I had no choice. But I'm glad you're taking responsibility. That says a lot." Ava offered a small, genuine smile. "If you need anything during your stay, please let me know. I'd like to make up for old mistakes by doing better now." Marianne patted Ava's shoulder gently. "Thank you. I appreciate that." An offer of support throughout Marianne's stay, Ava did her best to ensure the utmost care for her room arrangements and any special requests. In quiet moments, they chatted about old colleagues. Marianne mentioned that the airline had been short-staffed lately, especially with new travel demands rising. "They're looking for experienced crew, actually," she said. "It's a bit ironic, given the circumstances." Ava forced a smile. "I'm not sure if I'm ready to go back. But it's tempting." Marianne handed Ava a business card. "I'm not promising anything, but if you ever want me to put in a good word for you, assuming you've really changed, I'd be willing to do that." Ava stared at the card, overcome with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "That means a lot." Confronting lingering doubt after Marianne checked out and headed home, Ava found herself pacing her apartment, card in hand, late into the evening. The possibility of returning to her old airline stirred a whirlwind of emotions: excitement, fear, guilt, and longing. She ran the scenario through her mind, gathering letters of recommendation from Linda, from her volunteer coordinator, from her hospitality class instructor, perhaps even from Samantha. Could she convince the airline to take a chance on her again? She also weighed the potential downsides. What if she returned to the same environment and faced colleagues who remembered her mistake? What if the stress of flying triggered her old behavior? The uncertainty gnawed at her. In a call with Jonathan, she voiced her concerns. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to deal with the judgment," she admitted. "I don't want to let them down a second time." Jonathan paused. "You're not the same person who made that mistake. You're growing. But you need to have a clear plan. How will you manage stress differently now? What steps will you take if you feel that old need for control creeping back in?" It was a fair question. One that required honest introspection. Ava realized she couldn't just rely on good intentions. She needed a strategy, whether that included continued counseling, setting boundaries, or reminding herself daily of why she was there. A meeting with Linda a few nights later, when the hotel lobby quieted, Ava approached Linda Brady's office. She knocked softly, and Linda waved her in. "Linda, can I talk to you about something?" Ava asked, voice hushed. She explained that she might try returning to an airline, and asked if Linda would be willing to provide a reference or letter of recommendation. Linda considered her for a moment. "You've been a solid employee here, Ava. Punctual, courteous, quick to learn. I've seen you diffuse tense situations with grace, like that time you handled the double-booked suite for the late-arriving guest." Ava nodded, remembering the frantic woman who'd arrived well past midnight, only to find her reserved room was unavailable. Instead of shrugging or blaming the system, Ava had actively called nearby hotels, then upgraded the guest for the following night at no extra charge. The guest left grateful, rather than furious. "I'd be happy to recommend you," Linda said, tapping her pen against her desk. "But I'll only do it if you're absolutely sure you want this. I don't want to lose a good front desk associate for a dream you're not confident about." Ava smiled weakly. "I appreciate your honesty, Linda. I'm not 100% sure. But I know I need to at least explore the possibility. If it doesn't work out, I might stay in hotel management. I need to see where this leads me." Linda nodded. "That's fair. Send me the details, and I'll write up something strong for you." Preparing for the next leap buoyed by Linda's support and Marianne's tentative offer, Ava set about gathering the rest of her references. Samantha wrote a glowing letter praising Ava's willingness to learn from her mistake, while the Meadowview Lodge coordinator highlighted Ava's dedication and compassion with the senior residents. When Ava read those letters, she felt a surge of hope, and a pang of disbelief. Could she have truly come this far? In parallel, Ava also continued her volunteer work. As she guided residents through weekend activities, she sensed how much she had grown to cherish these moments. If she did return to flying, she vowed to keep volunteering in some capacity. These interactions were her tether to humility, reminding her of the responsibility she held whenever she dealt with vulnerable individuals. An unexpected visitor one Saturday afternoon, Ava was stacking books in the Meadowview Lodge library when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to see Charles Watson standing by the doorway, hands in his pockets. Her breath caught, wondering if something had happened to Claire. "Is everything okay?" she asked, concern lacing her voice. Charles nodded. "Mom's fine. Actually, she's resting in the courtyard right now. We decided to volunteer here together, give back a little, you know." His gaze flicked around the room. "I didn't expect to run into you. Then again, maybe I should have." Ava felt a tangle of emotions. Relief that Claire was all right, surprise that Charles was volunteering, and a mix of gratitude and awkwardness. "I'm really glad to hear she's doing well," Ava managed, setting a book aside. "What brought you here?" Charles hesitated. "Truth be told, after what happened on the flight, Mom and I talked about how we wanted to be more active in supporting older communities. She told me about your apology, and how you were volunteering. It sort of inspired us to follow suit." Warmth and humility flooded Ava. The realization that her efforts, born out of regret and a desire to grow, had prompted Charles and Claire to do something positive made her eyes sting with emotion. That's wonderful," she said, voice tremulous. Charles nodded. "I also wanted to say, Mom asked if we could see you. But if this is uncomfortable," Ava shook her head, resolute. "No, I'd love to see her. If she's okay with it." They walked together to the courtyard, where Claire sat near a raised flower bed, trimming dry leaves from potted herbs. Her face brightened when she saw Ava. Slowly, Ava approached, heart pounding. It was one thing to exchange apologetic emails, it was another to stand face to face with the person she had wronged so deeply. A moment of reflection, Claire's eyes crinkled with a small smile. "Hello, Ava. I see you've been doing more than just talking about change." Ava swallowed, struggling to keep her composure. "Yes, ma'am. This place, it's been a blessing for me. Thank you for," she paused, inhaling, "thank you for accepting my apology. For not holding on to anger. Claire set the clippers aside. We all make mistakes, child. The question is whether we choose to learn from them. Clearly, you have. They shared a brief but powerful moment of silence, each reflecting on how far they had come. Charles hovered a few steps away, watching with quiet approval. Ava knelt by Claire's side, picking up a stray leaf that had fallen on the ground. I'm trying to move forward, Ava said softly. To do some good. In part, because I realized how easy it is to hurt someone when you're blinded by your own assumptions. Claire's gaze was gentle. I'm proud of you for choosing a better path. The sincerity in her voice brought Ava close to tears. She blinked them away, a sense of gratitude welling inside her. Thank you, she whispered. I won't forget that I owe a lot of this growth to what happened between us. I'm sorry it came at your expense. Claire reached out and patted Ava's hand. No more apologies. Just keep going. After they chatted for a few more minutes, Ava left Claire and Charles to their volunteering tasks, feeling lighter than she had in months. She realized that this encounter represented closure, proof that she could face her past without flinching, and that people she had hurt could still offer understanding and grace. In the days that followed, Ava completed her airline applications, updated her resume to highlight her new experience, and attached her letters of recommendation. She pressed submit on each one with a trembling hope. She knew not every airline would give her a second chance, but she believed that at least one might see the person she was becoming. Regardless of the outcome, Ava was content in the knowledge that she was finally acting from a place of humility, empathy, and genuine care. Whether she continued greeting guests at a hotel, assisting seniors in a lodge, or guiding passengers through the skies again, her future would be built on the lessons she had earned the hard way. The uniform might change, but the heart behind it would remain the same, dedicated to respect, understanding, and the undeniable power of compassion. Ava Wallace was pacing her modest apartment in the early hours of the morning, clutching her phone so tightly that her knuckles whitened. She had just received an email from a regional carrier, Blue Horizon Airways, inviting her for an in-person interview. Though she had submitted several applications to different airlines, she never fully expected to hear back, not with her history. Now, gazing at the official Blue Horizon logo on her screen, she felt excitement and dread swirl together. She spent the next few days preparing as best she could while balancing her hotel shifts and her volunteer hours at Meadowview Lodge. In her spare moments, she reviewed safety protocols, brushed up on customer service techniques, and reminded herself of the mistakes she had made with Claire Watson. Never assume, never rush to judgment, and always serve with empathy, she silently repeated. That mantra had guided her since her dismissal, shaping her new approach to every interaction. Linda Brady, the hotel manager, noticed Ava's mix of nerves and hope. One afternoon, after a busy check-in period, Linda approached Ava near the concierge desk. You seem preoccupied, she observed. Is anything on your mind? Ava hesitated, then pulled Linda aside. I got an interview with Blue Horizon Airways, she admitted, voice hushed. I'm thrilled but terrified. What if they ask about my termination? What if they think I'm irredeemable? Linda gave her a calm, reassuring look. You've proven yourself here, Ava. If you explain how you've grown, they might respect your honesty. Look how you've handled every challenge at this hotel, from resolving guest complaints to reorganizing our reservation system. That reflects who you are now, not who you were before. Buoyed by Linda's confidence, Ava dove deeper into interview prep. She called Samantha Beckett, her former in-flight mentor, who had been a supportive voice throughout her journey of introspection. Remember, Samantha said gently, you're not hiding what happened, you're demonstrating that it changed you for the better. Don't dodge the hard questions. Own them, and show you've learned. The day before the interview, Ava wrapped up her shift early and visited Meadowview Lodge. Surrounded by familiar faces, she found a sense of calm. Even cranky Mr. Saunders gave her a gruff nod, which she accepted as a heartfelt sign of approval. She spent time reading with a small group of residents, who listened intently as she shared a short travel story about mountain views and peaceful cabin scenes. Travel is so universal, she thought, remembering why she had fallen in love with flying in the first place. It brought people closer to experiences they might never otherwise have. That evening, as she ironed her interview attire, black slacks, a crisp white blouse, and a simple blazer, she recalled her last moments in a formal uniform. Her hands trembled a little, a flood of memories flashing by, walking the aisles of an airplane with certainty, then being escorted off in disgrace. She forced herself to breathe deeply. That person didn't respect others, she reminded herself. This time, I'll be different. The next morning, Ava arrived at the Blue Horizon Airways office, a low-rise building in a business park near the airport. The receptionist welcomed her politely and directed her to a waiting area. As she sat among a handful of other applicants, she gripped a folder containing her resume and letters of recommendation from Linda, Samantha, and her volunteer coordinator. Each letter praised Ava's growth, her attitude shift, and her dedication to service. When her name was called, Ava followed a neatly dressed HR representative into a small conference room. A panel of 3 people sat behind a long table, 2 men in shirts and ties, and a woman wearing a tailored jacket with the airline's insignia pinned to the lapel. They introduced themselves as part of the recruitment team and motioned for Ava to sit. During the conversation, the panel asked standard questions about her background and how she handled stressful scenarios. Ava highlighted her hotel experience, focusing on how she diffused tense situations with empathy. She spoke of her volunteer role at Meadowview Lodge, describing how it taught her to listen first and act second. She even told a brief anecdote about Mr. Saunders, emphasizing how she had learned patience and respect for each individual's needs. Finally, one interviewer broached the topic Ava had been dreading. You mentioned you were previously a flight attendant. Why did you leave your last airline? Ava's heart pounded, but she steadied herself. I was terminated following an incident with a passenger, she began, meeting each person's eyes in turn. I made assumptions about her belonging in first class and failed to check the facts. It was a serious lapse in judgment. Since then, I've spent a year rebuilding my approach to service. My volunteer work, my job at the hotel, and my ongoing classes in hospitality management have helped me learn how to respect every passenger's dignity. The panel exchanged glances. One of the men leaned forward. That's a significant admission, he said, his tone measured. How can we be sure it won't happen again? Ava exhaled, tension loosening slightly. This was the question she'd prepared for. I've put systems in place for myself, she explained. I check facts before acting, and I listen closely to the concerns of customers. More importantly, I know the consequences of letting authority overshadow compassion. I own my failure, and it motivates me to ensure it never happens again. They asked a few more follow-up questions, pressing gently on Ava's ability to handle conflict and stress. She answered as transparently as she could, leaving nothing hidden. When the interview ended, they thanked her for her honesty and told her to expect a response within a couple of weeks. Stepping out into the sunshine, Ava let out a shaky breath. Whatever happened next, whether she was hired or not, she felt she had finally honored her own transformation. She had been honest about her past and respectful in her approach. As she walked to her car, she allowed herself a small smile. For the first time, she realized she wasn't simply hoping for redemption. She had already begun living it. 2 suspenseful weeks trickled by without a word from Blue Horizon Airways. Ava Wallace threw herself into her work at the hotel, trying to distract her swirling thoughts with back-to-back check-ins, phone inquiries, and group reservation logistics. She spent her free hours at Meadowview Lodge, where the residents had started calling her the storyteller, for the way she enlivened afternoons with upbeat tales and small travel anecdotes. One late afternoon, as she was finishing her volunteer shift at the lodge, her phone buzzed in her jacket pocket. She glanced at the screen and saw an unfamiliar number. Tentatively, she answered, stepping into a quiet hallway. "Hello, this is Ava." A calm voice introduced herself as Melissa from Blue Horizon Airways. After an exchange of pleasantries, the woman said, "I'd like to formally offer you a position as a flight attendant with Blue Horizon. Your references were very positive, and we appreciated your openness during the interview." Ava's heart thudded. She almost couldn't believe the words. "Thank you," she managed, voice trembling slightly. "I'm excited, and very grateful." Melissa explained the starting salary, the probation period, and the upcoming training schedule. Ava nodded silently, capturing every detail on a notepad. She ended the call feeling a surge of relief and a tingle of fear. "I'm going back to the sky," she thought. "This time, I have to do it right." The first person she told was Linda, the next morning at the hotel. Linda's eyes lit up. "That's fantastic news. I'm thrilled for you, Ava. I'll miss having you here, but you deserve this chance." Ava's 2-week notice passed quickly. On her final day, her co-workers surprised her with a small send-off in the staff lounge, cupcakes, balloons, and a goofy card signed by everyone on the team. Linda gave a short speech praising Ava's diligence and kindness. With tears in her eyes, Ava thanked them all, promising to stay in touch. Next, she said goodbye to the residents at Meadowview Lodge. She felt a pang of sadness as she walked through the bright corridors one last time as a volunteer. Mr. Saunders, true to form, complained about her leaving. "Who's going to put up with me now?" he grumbled, but his eyes betrayed a touch of sentiment. Ava laughed softly. "I'll try to visit, I promise," she told him. Samantha Beckett and Jonathan Perry both offered practical advice on how to navigate airline training, reminding her that once she had new wings pinned to her blazer, she must never forget the lessons she'd learned. She shared her news with Charles Watson, too, who related to Claire. They sent her an encouraging note, "Congratulations, Ava. We wish you well as you start again, travel safely." Ava's eyes misted with gratitude when she read it. The first day of training at Blue Horizon was surreal. Ava stepped into a large classroom with about 20 other new hires, all dressed in business attire. She felt a flicker of déjà vu, remembering her earlier training at her old airline, yet everything now felt different. She was older, humbler, and resolute about doing better. The initial sessions covered familiar territory, emergency procedures, passenger safety, and daily routines. But Ava noticed a difference in her attitude. She approached each lesson with renewed appreciation for what it meant to be entrusted with passengers' well-being. Instead of feeling the rush of authority, she felt the weight of responsibility, and she welcomed it. Midway through the week, the trainer led a discussion on handling difficult passenger scenarios. He asked the group to share personal experiences or hypothetical approaches. Ava listened intently, thinking of her past mistake. When the trainer opened the floor for questions, she cleared her throat. "If we ever catch ourselves reacting out of frustration, how do we reset and focus on the passenger's needs?" The trainer smiled, impressed by the directness of her question. "By remembering our ultimate goal, to provide safety and comfort. If we feel frustration building, we pause, take a breath, and consider the passenger's perspective. Sometimes that's enough to diffuse our own tension." Ava nodded, storing away the advice. She felt a quiet sense of validation that she had the courage to address the very pitfall that once ended her career. This time, she planned to stay vigilant against any resurgence of arrogance or impatience. On the final day of orientation, the group received their uniforms. Ava gently ran her fingers over the neatly folded fabric, navy slacks, a light blue blouse, a trim blazer adorned with the Blue Horizon pin. Tears welled in her eyes. She recalled losing her old uniform in disgrace, and now, here she was, being given a second chance. She slipped on the blazer in front of a mirror, the reflection a poignant reminder of how far she had come. This uniform isn't about having power, she reminded herself. It's about having responsibility. When the instructor officially welcomed them to Blue Horizon and handed out their provisional ID badges, Ava stepped forward with the rest of her group, standing tall. Applause filled the room. She felt nervous and exhilarated in equal measure, but above all, she felt ready. Later that evening, sitting in her new apartment near the airport, she wrote in a small journal, her way of keeping track of personal milestones. "I won't forget," she wrote, "that real authority is grounded in empathy. I'm here to serve, to respect, and to care for those who trust me when they step onto my plane." As she closed the journal, she took a moment to picture Claire Watson's gentle face, Mr. Saunders' scowl-turned smile, Linda's supportive nod, and the unwavering kindness of Samantha, Jonathan, and Charles. Their faith in her had helped her reclaim her story. Tomorrow, she would embark on her first training flight with Blue Horizon, determined to honor every lesson she'd learned along the way. True authority is never about power alone, it's about empathy, responsibility, and respect for the people in our care. As we see in Ava's story, the moment we let pride or a sense of superiority guide us, we risk losing sight of our true purpose, to serve and uplift others. Real strength lies in the humility to acknowledge mistakes, the courage to learn from them, and the dedication to apply those lessons in every interaction that follows. Whether we're dealing with friends, colleagues, or complete strangers, taking a moment to listen, to verify, and to treat each person with dignity can prevent misunderstandings and pave the way for compassion. Sometimes, the hardest part is admitting we've been wrong, but that step opens the door to genuine growth and renewed purpose. For adults and seniors especially, the wisdom gained from life's trials can be our strongest asset. Reflecting on past missteps helps us see where we stumbled, and guides us toward a kinder, more thoughtful approach. Each day is a chance to ask ourselves, am I acting out of habit, or am I truly paying attention to the people around me? When we allow empathy to shape our actions, we discover the meaningful connections we've been yearning for, and we realize that respect is a two-way street. If you found Ava's journey relatable or inspiring, please consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and ringing the notification bell so you won't miss upcoming content that delves further into personal growth, empathy, and understanding. Feel free to leave a comment below about how you've learned from your own past mistakes or what aspect of Ava's story struck a chord. Your support helps this channel continue sharing meaningful stories and life lessons we can all benefit from.